Alright friends, welcome back to another exciting episode of CIS 1420, HTML5 and CSS 3. If you are watching this in a future semester, just know that I am using slides from the 4th edition of the Murrock HTML5 and CSS book. Don't be too concerned if you're on the 5th edition or later. The 5th edition just came out not super long ago prior to this. I just decided to use the 4th edition of the book just because it wasn't tremendously different from the 5th edition, so just be aware of that if you're watching this in the future with updated books. But the chapters are relatively lined up, I think, in a pretty concise manner that's close to what the 4th edition has. So, all right, so the first week you went over I used some of the Dr. J's modules for web technology, and it gave kind of an overview and went through some of the ideas and concepts. There's maybe a little bit of repeat this lecture, but I'm recording it specifically for the chapters 2 and 3 in the Murrock book. So this is coding, testing, validating, and using HTML. We will focus on using HTML, but of course we have to go over some of the other details as well. So let's look at chapter 2 real briefly here. I do have Visual Studio open currently, Visual Studio Code rather, and just to get this ready, I'm going to go to Open Folder, and I'm going to go into here. I've made a working directory, and I'm going to create a little folder called Week 2 Examples, and select that, and there we go. So I've got my folder ready, so when I want to create files, I can do it right there. Okay, so chapter 2, if we go through here a little bit, some of this again is going to be review of what you might already know, and some of it may be new to you, so make sure that you pay very close attention to what we're discussing. First of all, make sure that you're familiar with and can articulate the basic structure of an HTML5 document. So you'll have the doc type declaration. By convention, we often put this as capital right here, the doc type word here, but you could put it lowercase, it doesn't really matter. Just notice that this tag is very different from the others that are actual HTML. This isn't really considered actual HTML, it's just a directive to tell the browser what version of HTML is being used. And if you just put HTML, it just means use the most recent version of the HTML standard, which is 5, and has been so for many years. But if it goes to 6 at some point in the near future or distant future, this will still be, should still be the same doc type, and it'll update. So not doc type, or it looks like a not symbol, the exclamation point. If you're taking another programming course, you might recognize that. It looks like a Java not symbol, or C++ not, C#, etc. But just type doc type, so the exclamation point or bang doc type HTML. Then you have the HTML structure. Think of HTML as a person. The HTML tags make up the HTML element. These are kind of like a box on its side, so you can actually think of this as actually a box. The HTML box has to contain only 2 things, and can't really contain anything else. It should only have 2 things in it. The HTML, being the quote person, has a head and has a body. There should be no overlapping tags. The body isn't inside the head isn't inside the body. You have the head inside HTML, and then as a sibling to the head, you have the body inside the HTML as well. So I see a lot of students messing that part up. So just be very, very cautious of that. This is an example of a simple HTML5 document. Some of this might look familiar, but you've got HTML tags here. Now, this is the tag name or element name, HTML. You'll notice that right here, there's this little extra bit of information inside the angle braces, inside the tag. And these always go in open tags if you put them. They're called attributes. And they have a name value or key value pairs. So this one just happens to be lang equals, and then you have the actual value in double quotes. That's for language equals English. So it just tells the browser that the language that we're definitely using on this is English. You also have the head inside the HTML, so you've got the open and closing, and you've got the body inside the HTML. The tabbing, the indentation, is for our benefit. It is not necessarily or technically required, but it makes it very difficult for you to come back and read it, or for other developers to read your code if you don't use proper indentation. So anytime you have a parent element like HTML, remember they're kind of like a box, and then you've got these two boxes that live inside of it, head and body, those are indented one level, and then anything that lives inside those boxes, whether they're boxes or elements, I'm calling them boxes just loosely so you get the idea that it's kind of like a box or a container, and then these are things that live inside that, these have to be indented one level as well, or should be. So here's meta char set, that sets it to the UTF-8, that tells it that it's using a particular type of character set. This is the most common, so we want to use that. And then you would have a title right here. This should be on every page. You should have a title. In this case, it's San Joaquin Valley Town Hall, and that will show up in Google search results if you have it uploaded to a website. It'll also show up in the tab on a lot of browsers and in other places as well. The body, in here you contain whatever stuff you want to be visible on the actual page. So in this case, I've got an H1, which is a heading 1 element, and there's 3 paragraphs. There are 3 paragraphs here. So this is the first paragraph, the second paragraph, and the third paragraph. You'll notice that this third paragraph also contains an anchor tag right here. And notice that the anchor tag, if you again consider it like kind of like a box, this anchor tag lives inside the paragraph tag. Notice that these are not overlapped. The P and the A aren't switched in position. The A has to, if you opened an anchor tag, the A, you have to close it before you go to the next one out, which in this case is a P or a paragraph tag. Okay? So a little bit about that. We discussed that. There are different types of tags. Most elements arguably have opening and closing tags. So in its entirety, this would be called a heading tag. And right here, this is the opening tag, or heading element rather. This is the opening tag of the heading element. This is the closing tag of the heading 1 element. And then this is the opening tag of a paragraph element and the closing tag of a paragraph element. Okay, so these have an opening and closing tag. Now, with empty tags or void elements, so empty elements or void elements, you have things like this. They don't have any closing tags. So you've got BR for a line break, and also the image tag, which is probably the most popular empty tag. Empty doesn't mean it doesn't convey information. It means it just doesn't have a closing tag. So the image, IMG, has 2 attributes here, separated by a space. You've got src equals logo dot GIF, and then alt is the alternative text if the image doesn't load or if it's a screen reader that a person who has visual impairment is using, like JAWS, which is a popular piece of software. It will say alt equals Murroc logo. Okay, incorrect and correct nesting. I had mentioned this before. Nesting means kind of where that you don't have overlap of tags. So since I opened the P first and then the I second, that I actually has to be closed first before the P is closed. So you can think of it again, if you connect these like a box. This is a little box I for italics sitting inside of a bigger box P. Now, the incorrect nesting looks like this, and students do this all the time. A lot of people who are beginning to learn this, and sometimes just even professional developers as a mistake, if you incorrectly nest it, it probably won't display the way you expect. You'll notice that right here I opened the P and then opened the I, but then they closed the P before the I, and that's invalid. Okay, attributes, already talked about that. This one has 1 attribute up here. The anchor tag has 1 attribute, href, meaning the hypertext reference. That means when you make an anchor tag that creates a link to another page. And here it would be a local, a relative local page here. And it says when you were to click this, you would use this right here. Okay, you would go to this particular link. You could also have things like this. You could have the href. You could also have something like title, class. You could have all kinds of stuff, alt. So you could have multiple attributes. So in this case, there are 3. You have this one, href, this one, title, and its value, and then this one, class, and its value. Looks a little bit ugly, so I'm going to change that. I don't know why that was there. And the next thing, empty tag with attributes. We already seen this, right? So you've got the source attribute and the alt attribute. There are also these types of attributes called Boolean attributes. In this case, if you have an input element, you can make it a checkbox, for example, and maybe it's got a name, mail list, or whatever. And if you want it checked by default, you can just type the word checked. You don't have to say checked equals checked or checked equals true in double quotes or anything like that. You just either put it there or you leave it out. If it's not there, it won't be checked. If it is there, it will. So that's called a Boolean attribute. Other attributes for identifying HTML elements. This helps especially when you're doing styling with CSS, and also it will help when you get into JavaScript, or if you have a JavaScript developer who needs to do certain kinds of runtime dynamic manipulation of your page while the user's interacting with it. They might have to grab something by its ID or grab something by its class. The ID attribute and the class attributes are very common HTML attributes. So ID equals page. Technically, there should only be, for example, in this case, there should only be one thing or one element in the page, in a given page, with that ID. There should not be multiple. A class, on the other hand, indicates that this particular anchor tag belongs in a grouping of these anchor elements or different elements that are called nav links. And it's okay to have multiple. In fact, that's usually what the case is. All right, comments. Now, if you've taken another programming course, you're familiar that comments are ignored by whatever the interpreter or compiler is, and the same thing goes for HTML, except the syntax is a bit different. With HTML, you again use these angle braces, so like a less than and greater than sign. We call them angle braces when we're not using them with math. And to open the comment, you put bang hyphen hyphen, or exclamation point hyphen hyphen, and then you put whatever the comment is. This will be ignored. This entire thing is ignored by the browser when it renders your page. It's just for putting description stuff to the developer. And to close it, you put hyphen hyphen and then closing angle brace. And then you put the actual code. So you can put these really throughout. They could be multiple items, and you can even, if you're testing out stuff, a lot of times people will comment out a portion of code. So this comments out the HTML code. So you might just maybe not even have the comments here. You would just take this comment syntax and surround whatever code you're trying to eliminate from the page, but you might want to keep it, but in case you want to open it again or change it, but you're just testing and you don't want to delete it right away, that might be a good move. Okay, so that's HTML. So when we create HTML, if I create it inside of this folder here, I'll right click and go to new file, and I'm just going to call this index.html. We're going to put our doc type. Again, the doc type part can be capitalized or not, doesn't really matter. Lang equals N for English. I'm going to, let me see here. Let's change the font size here. So you can go into the lower left corner, there's a little settings button, gear button. I can go under settings and should be able to go, yeah, text editor font. And let's try to increase the font size a little bit. So maybe I'll make it 30 or something and see if that makes it a little bigger. And it does. It makes it pretty darn big. So maybe that's a little too big. So I'm going to go back in settings and maybe change it to say 24. And that's pretty good. That's a little nicer. All right. So HTML lang equals N for English. And we know that we can only have 2 children inside HTML. You've got the head. And Visual Studio Code actually fills in the closing tag for me. And inside of those, we can put additional information. So I'm tabbing here, and Visual Studio Code is picking up the fact that I want this to be a good-looking document that can be easily read. So it's actually double tabbing it for me automatically, but you can always hit back if you need it to go back. Let's do meta, well, we'll do title first. I'm going to say testing HTML3 and CSS, or HTML5 rather, and CSS3. And meta char set, not meet, that's unfortunate. Meta char set equals UTF-8, there we go. And we could put that, it doesn't really matter. You could put it before or after the title. I'll just keep consistent with what they do in the book. And then in the body, the head also as a note, this is where we would put links to external CSS files and also JavaScript files. You could put them up there. A lot of people put those in the body. But in the body, we can have some H1. We'll say, welcome to CIS 1420. Okay, and then what I'm going to do, just to be safe here, I'm going to go under View and here on Visual Studio Code and go to Word Wrap and check that. I'm going to type lorem and hit Tab. And in case you just need any like dummy text to fill out something to see how it looks or see how you've styled it and things like that, if you just type lorem, L-O-R-E-M, and then hit Tab, that tends to be really good. So if I do lorem times 5 and hit Tab, it'll actually do it 5 times, which is nice, or 5 times as many characters. There's a bunch of other stuff you can do, but usually this is pretty sufficient. So I'm just going to leave this for now. And we got that paragraph. And let me see here. Maybe you want an H2 that says with Dr. J. And if I want to look at this, I can actually bring this over here and open it up with Google Chrome. And not very pretty, but you can see that this is a heading 1, heading 2, and then this paragraph information right down here. Okay, so far so good. Now, as I'd said, that's not very pretty, and back in the day you used to put a bunch of attributes and things like that on directly on HTML elements to tell it what color and different things like that, but we've advanced beyond that. We have separated the style of the page, the design and style, from the structure and content, basic structure and content. So the structure and content is the HTML. We look at that kind of as nouns, as you might have seen previously. And then the CSS are like the adjectives. So they describe the noun. So for example, I want the H1, for example, to be navy blue. So this is what CSS looks like. You'll see that it's a different language from HTML. It's not the same language. So in this course, you have to learn fairly thoroughly 2 different languages. You have to learn HTML, and you also have to learn CSS. So HTML is hypertext markup language. CSS is cascading style sheets, and they do have different syntax. So this is called a selector. Specifically, this is a type selector, H1. So it says, look at the thing that is an H1 or any H1s on the page, set the property color to the value navy, and then a semicolon at the end to end that that rule or declaration. So let's look and see what that does. Now, again, if we go into Visual Studio Code, I'm going to, for now, inside the head, we can just put style inside here, and you could do type equals text/CSS. But truth be told, the type equals text/CSS is the default, so you technically don't need that. So we're just going to put style, and I'm going to say I want the H1 to have the color purple. All right, semicolon at the end there. Visual Studio Code actually puts this nice little color selector here. This is obviously not part of the HTML standard or CSS standard. This is just a nice little widget that Visual Studio Code inserts here so that you can work easily with colors. So I'm just making this purple. It does that with a few different things, like just like the finishing off the tags for you and including dummy text when you say lorem and hit tab. Those things really help. but they're not actually part of HTML or CSS. They're just part of Visual Studio Code to help us. So this should make anything that's an H1 purple. So let's open this up, and you'll see, it's kind of hard to see, this is actually purple right here. Now let's make it another color, so maybe it'll be a little more obvious. Make it orange. There are some named colors, but we don't just need to use those. Yep, very orange, right? You can use other techniques, which we'll look at again, but you probably saw them in a previous video. These are examples. So for example, you might, in the body, so the entire body, you might want it to have a background color of whatever this color is. Now this is a hex shade here. The first 2 digits represent red, the second 2 digits represent green, and the last 2 digits represent the concentration of blue. Okay, so this is called hexadecimal values. Typically we don't, you may not need to worry about them too much. You can look up a hex color palette, so just look up hex colors. Google actually has one built into it, so you don't even have to go to the website. You can drag this along here and find kind of a color range you're in, and then drag it around here and try to find what you like. Maybe you like maybe a green, kind of a brighter green. It'll give you the RGB values, so it'll say it's 27 in intensity of red, 209 for green, and 10 in intensity for blue. So this is very, very green. And it'll also give you the hex value for that. So I can actually, you could copy it by just hitting the little copy button here, and you copy it, and then I could go back in here and then just paste it there. And it even knows what it is, right? So it says it's a color. You can pick them in here. It'll actually change it to the particular hex value, so you could just use the built-in tools as well. The other thing that's handy is you can also, if you might be into graphic design and can do it yourself, or you want tools that will help you, so you could say color, we'll say color themes for websites or something like that. And it'll give you, you can find all kinds of examples. Okay, so color scheme, color theme, either Canva is one of the sites that does this. So you could go here and read about color theory and a bunch of other stuff. Let me see here, color hunt, color wheel is another thing you could search. Color wheel. Canva has a color wheel. This is actually a handy one that I use. You can tell it whether you want like complementary colors or monochromatic, analogous, triadic, tetradic, all these things. So if I want maybe complementary colors, you'll notice as I drag it around this wheel, it kind of keeps these circles, or tries to make these circles be equidistant from the center. And you'll notice it's changing the color scheme of this actual page, so you can see how it all works together. And it's very cool. So let's say I like these 2 colors. I could maybe make one the background color and one of them the font color or something like that. So you can just pick them and then find the, here you just click it and it copies it. You don't even have to right click or highlight or anything. So it's really, really cool. So canva.com and then /colors/color wheel, or you can just Google it. All right. So this is all you need, really. You just find the hex value for the color and you can paste it. Some of the colors are named. There's like a few hundred that are actually have names. And then there's also RGB function where you can actually put in the decimal values or percentages and saturations. Okay, so here you'll see other things like some of these can have borders. So if you want to have a bottom border on something, or just the bottom border rather than the full border, you can do that. So I could go into here, go to CSS, and maybe I'm going to make the H2 have a bottom border of whatever this orange color is that they have, and then open it, see what happens, and you'll see there is in fact a bottom border that is orange. All right. And let's say I want to make this also have a color of maybe blue. Okay, there you go. And you've still got the orange border at the bottom. Okay, so it's actually getting a lot prettier. So you basically you use the CSS to give some style to your page, whereas the HTML is for the general layout and the content. Okay, they're just showing you kind of a variety here. They're saying that we can have a certain thickness to the border, the type of border. So this says solid, but if I wanted to, I could go in here and then change it to something like, you can look up the valid values for this, but dashed is one of the options. So if I open this up, you'll see it's dashed, right? All right, so that's an option. And you can see that even just this little bit of CSS, you can see that the sky's really the limit for a lot of this. Elements can also be selected by their type, ID, or class. So far we've been doing it with the type. So these are both type selectors, H1 and H2. And we're using an embedded style. There's other options, which we'll talk about. But let's say I have this H2, and then I have another H2 down here. Let's say other information down here. And maybe I have a lorem ipsum down there as well, some other information. But I want this H2 to be distinct, or the first one to be distinct. Let's actually copy and paste this one and say even more information. So I've got 3 H2s now. And let's say the top one should be distinct. So I'm going to give it a class of, we'll say, primary, or maybe we could call it top underscore class or something like that. So I'll call it top class. Not a real good name, but we'll do that. And then in here, to make a class selector, I can't just type top class because there's no element with that name. So there's no type with that name. So I can't just do that. It knows all the HTML, like H1, H2's body, anything like that. Paragraph P, right? That's a selector, type selector. But I can tell it anything with the class by putting a dot, top underscore class, and that says this is a class selector. As a note, the type of comments in CSS have to be this kind. They allow for multiple lines as well, but it has to be / and then * to end it. So we'll say this uses a class selector, right? And oops. And then up here, I'm going to put a comment. This uses a type selector. Okay. Pretty good. So what do I want type class to have? Well, let's say I want this one to have a special color. Maybe I want it to be to stand out with red from its cousins that are blue over here. And maybe I want it to have just a full border, 5 pixels, solid green. Okay, and let's see what that does. So you see that this H1 right here with Dr. J is very different from the other two. The other two have the default, just the type selector for H1, but this one right here, since the class was more specific, it overrides the colors that are options for the regular H1s. So this one gets its own red color and also is surrounded by this big green box. Okay? So, so far so good. And you can also go by ID as well. So ID, again, it's generally preferred to use classes, but ID can be styled as well using a pound symbol or hash symbol right here. And you can tell it things like the font size, alignment, color, anything else that you can use that are properties as well. All right, so make note of slide 16 in the 4th edition's slides. You can see that we have all these different options here. So you've got type selectors, body and H1 up here. You've got the ID selector. There should only be one thing with a single ID, and then class selector down there. All right, now they use brackets in the book. Brackets is the name of a web editing or text editing software that's used frequently for the web. I personally like Visual Studio Code better. You're welcome to use whatever IDE, not IDE, but text editor, I'd say web editing software. Don't use something like Dreamweaver or something that generates code for you, because you'll never learn that way. And also, to be frank, a lot of developers that do front-end development, they might do some design and stuff like Dreamweaver, but they do a lot of it with just hand coding to keep everything perfect. And you'll find that you actually have much more control once you know exactly what's going on. Okay, so that's brackets. They go through common errors, like don't want to have these problems. So opening tag without a closing tag, misspelled tag or attribute names, quotation marks aren't paired, incorrect file references. So if I want to go to a particular image, I might have the wrong link to that image. Common CSS errors, braces that aren't paired, missing semicolons, those are required. Misspelling is bad in both of them. ID or class names that don't match. Okay, so those are common as well. So if I went in here and let's say this class's name is actually top class 2, then this class right here, top class, won't apply to it. There's nothing with top class, so it's not going to actually work. If I try opening it now, you notice that it will have defaulted to the regular H1 styling because it can't find that class. It has no idea what to do with it. Top class 2 doesn't exist. So when you name it in the actual as an attribute in the HTML, you don't put the dot in front of it. It's just in CSS that signals to it that, hey, I'm talking about a class. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay. All right, we don't need that. Okay, I already showed you how to browse it. There are other things you can do. You could upload it to the CS or the HTML validator on W3C. So it's basically validator.w3.org. The W3C is the Worldwide Web Consortium. They come up with the rules for basically the web, and then all the browser manufacturers typically try to adhere to those standards as best as possible. But just be aware of this. You could upload the file, paste it, go to a particular URL on the web, and then ask it, hey, is this valid HTML? And then it will provide recommendations or tell you what you might have wrong. So it helps. So for example, like in here, this is called Jigsaw. This is the CSS validator. This will tell you if there's problems with, say, CSS. Okay. So that's the Chapter 2 stuff. Chapter 3, a lot of this was already covered in the previous video for the web tech module that I provided, but hopefully this will give you maybe a little bit more information. I've also covered some of it just in my discussion previously, but just notice that there's a lot of stuff that you can put in the head section. I already showed you styles you can put in there, but you can also put in meta information, and we already saw meta char set UTF-8, but you can also put a meta description and also keywords. Keywords should be unique to each page, as the description should be as well. And this helps search engines and SEO, so you can change the data in here. For keywords, for the meta tag, you really shouldn't, what you do is you separate them by commas, and it's okay if they're multiple words, that's fine. But you shouldn't have any more than 10 keywords. So this would be 1 keyword. This is town halls 2, speakers 3, lectures 4, luncheons 5. I would say try to stay around 5 or 6. Don't go any more than 10. That just makes it really difficult. So yeah, SEO guidelines. They tell you what to limit your titles and things like that to make it look good on the Google page and things like that. Okay, these are all block elements. So H1, H2, and P are block elements, meaning that they automatically they automatically form themselves on a new line. So you'll notice that when we open this page over here, that the H1 automatically is on its own line, and then when the H2 forms, it's automatically on its own line. Same thing with the H2s down here, and also with the paragraphs. They get on their own lines automatically. They don't try to fill in right after here. So that's what makes it a block element. You also have inline elements like this. So in this case, it's very common if we want to, for example, italicize something. The old school way would be to put an I tag, an I element around something. But let's say lorem ipsum, I want to make that italicized. you should actually put EM for emphasis. I'm going to move that in there because italics says specifically, this has to be italicized, whereas EM means just do something to emphasize it. Now, by default, the browser is going to interpret it as italicized, but you can also style it and change it. You can use CSS to style it. So just be aware of that. And, okay, yeah, there's other stuff here as well. You'll notice that here you can use actually some of these tags that are inline, like sub, because they wanted to do H2O, so they put H2O here, and they wanted the 2 to be in a subscript. And then there's different things like Brock21, what they have there. That is supposed to be KBD. That's basically in kind of a mono space font that looks like code. Okay. Beyond the block elements, which are on their own line, and then inline elements, which do not create themselves on their own line. They go in line with whatever you're typing. In addition to those, we also have character entities. Now, this is if, in many cases, you can't use certain symbols. Like, for example, what would you think would be the problem if I wanted to make a statement, say, let's say under other information, I want a second, let's say the first paragraph has some math information, and I want to say 6 is greater than 2. What do you think the problem there is? Or 6 is less than 2. You'll see that Visual Studio Code is actually telling me something's weird here, because this is used in HTML, so that could be a problem, right? So we can't have that. And then maybe you say, well, 2 less than 6. We'll make it correct at least, and we'll say 6 greater than 2. But it could get confused and think this is an element because it has open and closing braces. Well, we can't have that, so how do we get over that or get around it? And you use what are called character entities. I say and symbol, LT, and semicolon. So usually it's a bunch of, or some manner of characters between an ampersand and a semicolon. And that is called a character entity. That means less than. For this one, you could probably guess it's and GT, semicolon. There's others as well, like and copy for copyright. There's and amp for ampersand, because remember the ampersand has special meaning, clearly. So using the ampersand willy-nilly is not good because that starts a character entity. So I have to have some way to escape it or tell it that I actually want an ampersand. For example, like here, if I put an and, it's going to think maybe I'm starting a character entity. So and amp is a very common one. And you'll also notice that Visual Studio Code is actually helping me find them. So you notice when I started typing, it'll start giving me possibilities. There's a ton of character entities, but some are used way more than others. If I run this page now, or open this page now, you'll see that it does in fact show the math. So it's actually pretty straightforward. And it avoids the problem with the HTML tags. Okay, character entities. They used a character entity for the copyright symbol, as you can see. They put and copy down here. All right, pretty good. Core attributes that you should be aware of. We've talked about some already, but they're in the book summarized as well. But you've got the lang class, title, and ID. So you should become familiar with those and what they do. You should always code the lang attribute on the HTML element to identify the language for the page. Typically, this is going to be English, at least for what we're doing. But especially for people who are maybe multilingual or bilingual, or you might be doing a website for someone where you're maybe just mostly copy and pasting the information in another language. You need to make sure that the browser knows what language it's in. So back in the day when we wanted to group off sections, there were really only 2 major options that didn't add too much styling. There were divs for block elements, so you would use the div keyword, div, and then there were span for inline elements. You would say there's a span here. Divs especially, people started wanting to style them and make certain sections of their page different styles, so they would do things like, they would say div class equals header, and then put headings inside of it, or div class equals main, div class equals footer. Now, what happened is the people at the W3C, who are very cognizant of this practice, decided, you know what, it makes a lot more sense that people would have access to these specific elements that don't really do anything special except they behave like divs, but they all have different names. So people have to stop typing. They end up with this thing we call div soup, where you've got a div inside of a div inside of a div inside of a div, and it looks kind of ugly. It could still happen with structured elements, or semantic elements, but it's less common. So instead of saying div class equals header, we actually just type header, because this exists as a semantic element. There are different semantic elements, like there's header, main, footer, there's article, there's aside, there's nav for navigation menus, which people were all using just divs for that for the longest time. And now they've added this semantic meaning to it. They don't actually style it differently unless you do something in CSS, which you usually would want to. But it also keeps them from having to type a div. Now, if there isn't an appropriate or common semantic element available, it's still okay to use divs, but you want to prefer semantic elements over the divs, the regular divs. Okay, figure and fig caption are also elements that exist here. So if you have a figure you're trying to show something of, maybe I just want to show what is the code. So this prevents it from actually executing JavaScript. You surround it with code, and it will show this JavaScript code on the page. And then inside the figure element, you have fig caption to say what it looks like under it. So this is what it renders in the browser. So if you have maybe a page teaching someone how to do coding in a particular way, or quotes or things like that, or you have an image there as the figure for a science project or whatever you want to use the figure, and then inside the figure you have fig caption, so it knows it's associated with this figure. This is also new to HTML5 that did not exist before. Okay, this one they're just showing you a page structure with div and span elements. Again, we would usually not want to give these IDs or classes of header and main and footer. We would want to just use the semantic elements, but this is more the older style. But you can still create divs and you can still style them and give them IDs and classes just like before. They're not deprecated, meaning they are still considered good code. It's just you want to prefer, now for new development, you want to prefer semantic elements. Like I would say header instead of div ID equals header. Okay. Ideas now about the website folder structure. This is important to know, and it even goes on your file system. A lot of, for example, this website might have a root folder, which is the top level, and it might have a folder for images, or directory for images, a directory for styles, books. Maybe if it's Muroc's page, they want to have different folders for the different books, maybe service, about, etc. And how do you work with URLs? So an absolute path, meaning if you code the whole thing from the top all the way down to whatever page or image you're looking at, that's called an absolute path or an absolute URL. You don't usually want to do this unless it's an external web page, meaning if I'm on my website and I want to make it go to Muroc, I would go in here and maybe put let's do that near the top here. I'm going to do maybe an H2 and type links. All right, and we'll do an unordered list, which also was in another set of tags, or another set of slides, and list item, you'll recall. I'm just going to put href equals http://www.google.com. So I close the anchor tag. It creates a closing tag for me. I close the open anchor tag with the angle brace, and then I just type Google, like there, and it should create a link. So if I highlight this, I do get my link to Google. If I click on it, it takes me to Google, which is exactly what I want. But you notice I coded the full URL, right? Now, if it's local, let's say I have another page or an image or something that's inside my website. Let me actually grab one. Maybe I'll look up Superman or something, get an image of Superman, and I'm going to maybe save image as, just grab this image, go into my little folder over here, into the workdir, into week 2 examples, and I'm actually going to create another subfolder called images, and go into that, and I'm just going to call it superman.png. Okay, so there we go, and you'll see that it is in fact in a new folder, and even Visual Studio Code recognizes it. I could have created that in Visual Studio Code, and it would have done it on the file system or vice versa. So it has created it, and I do have superman.png. Well, I don't want to go to the top level and go all the way down, but maybe I want to put a picture right under the H2 here. Maybe I want it to be image source equals, and the way to grab it, I'm just going to say, okay, I'm index.html, and in the same folder as me is a folder called images. So I'm going to type images and then say slash superman.png, because I know that's inside of that folder, right? So let's see if that actually loads if I refresh this, and it does. And there you go. Now, if it was in a different folder, like they're saying here, if you want to go up a level, I could actually put it in a folder one level up, and I would just say ... meaning go to my parent, and then go in, and then find me the image. You could go up and then into another folder, and then the image. And again, also, if you need to go up 2 levels, ... slash, and then some folder slash some image .png or something like that. Okay. These are called document relative paths that navigate down. That's exactly what we were using. Usually you just say relative. If it's root relative, it'll go to the root of the entire website that you're in, which is not always what you want. So typically I would say use the document relative paths, and only use absolute URLs if it's an external web page, meaning it's not the web page that the website that you're currently on. Since I'm not Muroc.com, I don't have access to that web page, and I'm not doing anything with it, but I want to link to it, I would just put an external link. So I'd say href equals http Muroc.com, Muroc, okay. And then when I load this, you'll see it's now a link, and it goes to Muroc Books. All right, looking pretty good. Link examples, we did links already, so I'm not going to belabor this too long. SEO, they give you SEO information. This is how I create lists. Just as a note, I already showed you an unordered list, so U for unordered. It just gives you bullet points. You still use the list item in either of these. The other one is ordered list, so this does it by number. So it'll show 1, 2, 3 instead. So 1, 2, 3, and then there's no number because it's unordered. All right, image element, already seen it, so no big deal. Some common formats that are supported by most browsers are JPEG, GIF, which I don't like the pronunciation, but that's how the guy who created it made it, so I prefer GIF, but it's actually supposed to be GIF, which makes me sad. So portable network graphics, though, I would say if you can get away with any of these, PNGs are very good because they're a lossless format, and they're very, very good quality. JPEGs are smaller, so JPEG are also a very good option when it's something that doesn't need to be really super high quality, but you need an image there, like basic clip art and things like that. Those tend to be better with JPEGs because they're really small. Accessibility guidelines. Whenever you hear about accessibility and usability, these are two kind of sides of the same coin. Usability is just general users being able to use your site and find links and things like that and be able to navigate without too much frustration. Accessibility has to do with people with disabilities being able to navigate your website. This actually is very serious, especially if you end up working for a government organization or any kind of organization that, universities and colleges and things like that. In fact, OCC many years ago had a very serious situation with accessibility on their website. And because of people not being able to get to certain pages, if they were, couldn't see or something like that, had visual impairment, they actually ended up with, OCC ended up with a violation from the Office of Civil Rights. So it was a very, very serious issue. They had to redo the entire website, hire an outside firm, and make sure that everything was accessible. So it caused quite a headache for several months, and it would have been better if it just would have been done before. This has been many years since that, but it was a very serious issue. So they're just showing you examples of pages and how they got that page, etc. So I've showed you an example already. I will upload the example in a zip file, and you should be able to download it as needed. So I hope this was useful for you, and that you just read through the appropriate chapters according to the syllabus for this week and do some practice, kind of like I did here. Make sure you understand the general ideas. We will get more specific as we go along and get more deliberate about what elements do what, or additional elements. You should know some of them by now, like HTML, head and body. You should definitely know those. You should know the H1's elements. You should know what the anchor tag does, the A tag, and also the basic CSS that we did today, just to get an idea of what CSS is for and what HTML is for. And we'll see a whole lot more of this in the future. All right, so I will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.